Did you really think I would not come back for you, Jason? The music inside the luxury ballroom faltered as if the entire room had taken a breath and forgotten how to release it. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of perfectly arranged white roses, and beyond them, 100 guests turned in slow disbelief toward the entrance. There she stood, not in soft pastels or delicate lace like the other women in the room, but in black. Sleek, controlled, unapologetic. Emily Carter stepped forward, her heels echoing across the marble floor like a countdown none of them could stop. 7 years ago, this same man had laughed while walking away from her in front of a crowd, just like this. Tonight, he could not even hold her gaze. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The bride's smile trembled first. Sophia Langley, wrapped in designer silk and diamonds that caught every flicker of light, tightened her grip on Jason's arm. "Who is she?" she whispered, but her voice carried farther than she intended. Jason did not answer. His face had gone pale, the kind of pale that came from memory, not fear. Because he knew. Of course he knew. Emily took another step forward, her expression calm in a way that made people uneasy, the kind of calm that came after something had already burned to the ground. A server froze mid-stride, a glass of champagne trembling in his hand. Somewhere in the back, a phone lifted quietly, someone already sensing that whatever was about to happen would be something people would talk about for years. Emily's eyes moved across the room, not searching, not hesitating, just measuring. Every detail, every face, every whisper. This world had once rejected her, laughed at her, erased her like she had never belonged. But now, she walked through it like she owned every inch. She stopped just a few feet from the altar, her gaze finally locking onto Jason. The silence stretched thin, sharp enough to cut. "Go on," she said softly, tilting her head as if inviting him to continue the ceremony. "Do not let me interrupt something built on lies." A ripple of murmurs spread instantly. Sophia's grip tightened further. "Jason, what is she talking about?" Still, he said nothing, because somewhere between the past and this exact moment, the balance of power had shifted, and everyone in that room could feel it. They just did not understand why yet, but they were about to. Jason Whitmore finally found his voice, but it came out thinner than anyone in that room had ever heard before. "Emily, what are you doing here?" The name alone was enough to fracture the illusion. A ripple moved through the guests, whispers rising like a tide. Emily, not a stranger, not a mistake, someone from before. Emily's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something far more controlled. "That depends," she said, her tone even, almost gentle. "Are you asking as the man who left me standing in front of 200 people, or as the groom who is about to promise forever?" The words landed harder than any accusation. Sophia turned sharply toward Jason, her composure cracking for the first time. "You know her," she said, not asking but demanding. Jason swallowed, his hand loosening from Sophia's as if even that small connection suddenly felt dangerous. The officiant stepped back instinctively, sensing that whatever ceremony had been planned no longer belonged to him. The room shifted from celebration to something else entirely, something raw and unscripted. Emily took another step closer, close enough now that Jason could see every detail he had once ignored. The confidence in her posture, the steadiness in her eyes. There was no trace left of the girl he had dismissed. Not in the way she stood, not in the way she breathed, not even in the silence she held between her words. "You look surprised," she continued softly, her gaze never leaving his. "That is interesting. I remember a different night. You were not surprised then. You were very certain." The air seemed to tighten around them. And just like that, the past began to bleed into the present. 7 years earlier, the ballroom had been smaller, less extravagant, but just as full. Laughter had filled the space then too, though it had not sounded like this. It had been sharper, colder, directed. Emily had stood near the center of that room in a simple dress that no one bothered to remember, her hands trembling just enough that she kept them hidden at her sides. Jason had not looked nervous that night. He had looked bored, irritated even, as if the entire evening had been an inconvenience he was finally ready to end. This was a mistake, he had said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Conversations had stopped one by one until all that remained was his voice and the echo of it. Emily had blinked, confused at first, thinking she had misunderstood. "What do you mean?" she had asked quietly. Jason had let out a short laugh, not cruel in his mind, just dismissive. "I mean this," he gestured vaguely between them. "You and me. It does not work. It never did." Someone near the back had whispered something that triggered a few scattered laughs. Jason had not stopped. "You are not exactly what I need," he added, choosing his words as if he were discussing a business deal, not a person. "I need someone who fits my world." Emily had felt every eye in the room land on her, measuring, judging, agreeing. "And I do not," she had asked, her voice smaller now, though she tried to hold it steady. Jason had shrugged. "You were convenient. That is all." The sentence had ended whatever hope she had left, and the silence that followed had been worse than the laughter. Back in the present, the memory seemed to hang in the air between them, invisible but undeniable. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were the one being evaluated now. "You said I did not belong in your world," she reminded him, her voice calm but unyielding. Around them, the guests had gone completely still. Even the music had stopped entirely. "So tell me, Jason," she added, her eyes flicking briefly to the towering chandeliers, the polished marble, the carefully curated perfection of it all before returning to him. "What happens when the world you chose starts to belong to me instead?" No one moved. No one spoke, because for the first time that night, it was no longer clear who held the power. And Jason knew it. Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. For a man who had built his reputation on control, on always knowing exactly what to say and when to say it, the silence was suffocating. Around him, the room no longer felt like a place of celebration. It felt like a stage, and somehow, he had become the one being exposed under the lights. Sophia stepped forward then, her heels sharp against the marble, her composure stitched together by sheer force. "I think you have said enough," she said, her voice tight, but controlled as she turned to face Emily directly. "This is a private event. If you have something to say, you can leave and say it somewhere else." Emily shifted her gaze to Sophia, and for a brief moment, something unreadable passed through her expression. Not anger, not jealousy, something quieter, almost pity. "Private," Emily repeated softly, as if tasting the word. "That is interesting, because the last time my life was turned into a public spectacle, no one seemed to mind." Sophia's jaw tightened, but she held her ground. "Whatever happened between you and Jason is in the past," she said firmly. "This is our wedding." Emily let out a small breath, almost like a laugh, but without humor. "Yes," she said, nodding slowly. "That is what makes tonight so important." The tension thickened, pulling every eye in the room tighter around the three of them. Jason finally found a fragment of his voice. "Emily, stop," he said, his tone low, almost pleading now. "This is not the place." Emily looked at him again, and this time there was no softness left at all. "You lost the right to decide that," she replied. The words were quiet, but they cut deeper than anything louder could have. And then, without raising her voice, without creating any dramatic gesture, she reached into the small black clutch at her side and pulled out a thin envelope. It was simple, plain, almost insignificant compared to the luxury surrounding it. But the moment it appeared, something shifted again. Jason's eyes locked onto it instantly, and for the first time, real fear flickered across his face. "Do you remember this?" Emily asked, holding it lightly between her fingers. "Or have you convinced yourself that night never happened the way it did?" Sophia glanced between them, confusion now overtaking her anger. "Jason," she said sharply, "what is that?" Jason shook his head quickly, too quickly. "It is nothing," he said. "Emily, do not do this." But Emily had already begun. "This," she said, her voice steady as she slid a single folded document from the envelope. is the agreement you asked me to sign the night you decided I was no longer useful to you. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The word agreement landed differently now. Not romantic, not personal, transactional, calculated. Emily unfolded the paper with careful precision, as if each movement had been rehearsed 1,000 times in silence. You told me it was just a formality, she continued, her eyes never leaving Jason. That it would help you clean up loose ends. That it was better for both of us. Jason took a step forward, his voice dropping into something urgent. Emily, please, he said. You do not understand what you are doing. She met his gaze without flinching. No, she said quietly. I understand perfectly. Sophia reached out, grabbing Jason's arm again, but this time it was not out of affection. It was to steady herself. What is she talking about? She demanded. What agreement? Jason did not answer. He could not, because the truth was already beginning to surface, not through explanation, but through silence. Emily turned slightly, angling the paper just enough that those closest could see the heading. Legal language, signatures, dates, evidence of something far more deliberate than a simple breakup. You told me I did not belong in your world, Emily said, her voice calm, almost reflective now. What you did not say was that you were already rewriting that world behind my back. The room seemed to lean in closer, drawn by something darker than curiosity now. So I signed it, she added. Not because I believed you, but because I wanted to see just how far you were willing to go. Jason's composure cracked completely then. Stop, he said again, louder this time. You are going to destroy everything. Emily held his gaze, unshaken. No, she said. You already did that. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching that whatever had begun years ago was never truly over. It had only been waiting for this exact night to finish. Jason's warning still hung in the air, but it no longer carried the authority it once had. The room had already shifted beyond his control. Emily folded the document slowly, deliberately, as if sealing something that had been waiting years to be opened. Sophia's eyes darted between them, her confusion sharpening into something more dangerous. Rewriting what world? She demanded, her voice rising despite her effort to remain composed. Jason, what did you do? Jason ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that once might have looked confident, but now only revealed how quickly he was unraveling. It is not what it sounds like, he said, though even he did not seem convinced. Emily tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm that made his desperation look even more obvious. That is interesting, she said quietly, because it sounds exactly like what it is. The murmurs in the room grew louder, no longer hidden behind polite smiles. Guests leaned closer to one another, whispering, analyzing, judging. This was no longer a wedding. It was a revelation. Emily stepped back just enough to give herself space, but not enough to retreat. She was not here to leave. She was here to finish something. You told me that signing this would protect both of us, she continued, her voice steady, almost reflective now. But what you really meant was that it would protect you. Jason shook his head, his voice tightening. Emily, you are twisting this. You agreed to it. She met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, she said. I agreed. Because I wanted to see the truth in writing. Sophia's breath caught. Truth about what? She pressed, her voice now edged with something closer to fear. Emily did not look at her immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, forcing the weight of the moment to settle over everyone present. Then, slowly she turned. About how far someone is willing to go when they think no one is watching, she said. Sophia's grip on Jason's arm loosened, not out of choice, but because her hand no longer seemed steady enough to hold on. Jason, she said again, quieter now, tell me what she means. But Jason could not answer, because the truth had already begun to take shape without him. Emily slipped the document back into the envelope and lowered her hand. You made a decision that night, she said, her eyes fixed on him. Not just to end something, but to erase it, to make sure I walked away with nothing. No connection, no claim, no voice. A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the crowd. The implications were no longer subtle. That is not true, Jason snapped suddenly, his composure cracking into something defensive, almost desperate. I gave you what you asked for. Emily's expression did not change, but something colder settled into her gaze. No, she said. You gave me what you thought I deserved. The words landed with precision. Around them, the guests shifted uncomfortably, the earlier excitement replaced by something heavier, something more unsettling. This was not entertainment anymore. This was accountability. Sophia took a step back, creating distance between herself and Jason for the first time that night. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something familiar, something reassuring, and finding none. Is any of this true? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper now. Jason looked at her, but the confidence that had once defined him was gone. In its place was hesitation, and that hesitation was enough. Emily watched the exchange quietly, not interrupting, not pushing. She did not need to. The truth was unfolding on its own. You built your life on control, she said softly, returning her attention to Jason. Every decision calculated. Every outcome managed. She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. But you made one mistake. Jason's eyes flicked back to hers, a flicker of something like dread passing through them. Emily's voice lowered, not for secrecy, but for emphasis. You underestimated what happens when the person you try to erase refuses to disappear. The silence that followed was absolute. No music, no movement, just the quiet realization spreading through the room that whatever Jason had constructed over the years was no longer secure. And for the first time, it was not Emily who stood on uncertain ground. It was him. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like glass under pressure. A whisper here, a sharp breath there, until the entire room was filled with a low, restless murmur that no one could fully contain. Jason felt it before he heard it. The shift in perception, the subtle but undeniable change in how people looked at him. Not with admiration, not with respect, but with doubt. And doubt, in his world, was far more dangerous than anger. Emily stood perfectly still, her presence steady, grounded, as if she had already moved past this moment long before anyone else had even realized it was coming. She was not here to react. She was here to reveal. Sophia took another step back, her distance from Jason now unmistakable. The space between them was small, but it might as well have been miles. You said she was nothing, Sophia said, her voice uneven now, no longer controlled. You said she was just someone from your past. Jason's jaw tightened. She is, he replied quickly, too quickly. This is just, she is trying to manipulate the situation. Emily let out a quiet breath, almost like a sigh, but there was no exhaustion in it. Only clarity. Manipulate, she repeated softly. No, Jason. I learned that from you. The words settled heavily. Jason took a step toward her, lowering his voice as if proximity could regain control. What do you want? He asked, his tone sharp now, defensive. Money? Recognition? Is that what this is? Emily's expression did not change, but something colder flickered beneath the surface. You still do not understand, she said. That is the problem. Around them, several guests had already taken out their phones, no longer pretending discretion. This was no longer private. It was becoming public in real time, spreading beyond the walls of the ballroom with every second that passed. Emily noticed, of course she did, but she did not react. Exposure was not her fear. It was her leverage. You believed that if you removed me quietly, everything would stay clean, she continued, her voice measured. No complications. No consequences. Jason's hands clenched at his sides. I ended a relationship, he snapped. That is all. Emily held his gaze, unshaken. No, she said. You ended accountability. The distinction landed like a verdict. Sophia's breathing had grown shallow, her eyes moving between them as if trying to piece together a version of reality that still made sense. What did he do? She asked again, this time directly to Emily, not Jason. Emily paused, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood the weight of giving it. Then, slowly she spoke. He made sure that when I walked away, I had nothing that could ever connect me back to him, she said. No shared records. No financial ties. No evidence that I had ever been part of his life in any meaningful way. The murmurs grew louder, more defined now. People were no longer guessing. They were understanding. Jason shook his head, stepping forward again, his composure slipping further. That is not illegal, he argued. That is protection. That is what people in my position do. Emily nodded once, acknowledging the truth in his words without agreeing with the intention behind them. Yes, she said. That is exactly what people in your position do. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. But what you did not consider was what happens when the person you tried to remove decides to rebuild. Jason's expression hardened, but beneath it, there was something else now. Unease. You think you rebuilt something? He said, a hint of disbelief creeping into his tone. You walked away with nothing. Emily's gaze sharpened slightly, and for the first time, a faint trace of something like quiet pride appeared. That is where you are wrong, she said. I walked away with everything I needed. Sophia's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? She asked. Emily turned to her fully now, her voice soft but precise. It means that while you were building a future with him, she said, I was building a future without him. The difference was subtle, but profound. And then, almost as an afterthought, Emily added, and that future turned out to be much larger than anything he ever planned for me. The words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Jason felt it then, not just the loss of control, but the realization that whatever Emily had become, it was something he had not accounted for, something he could not predict. And in his world, unpredictability was the one thing he had never learned how to handle. Jason let out a short, disbelieving laugh, but lacked any real confidence. It sounded hollow, forced, like something he was trying to convince himself of more than anyone else. Larger, he repeated, shaking his head slightly. You expect everyone here to believe that you somehow built something bigger than this? He gestured around the ballroom, toward the towering ceilings, the polished marble, the carefully curated luxury that had always defined his world. For a moment, it might have worked. For a moment, it almost sounded convincing. But then Emily looked around too, her gaze slow and deliberate, taking in every detail with a calm familiarity that did not belong to an outsider. And that was when the shift became undeniable. Yes, she said simply. No hositashchen. No need to justify. Just certainty. The single word landed heavier than anything she had said before, because it did not ask for approval. It assumed it. Sophia's eyes narrowed further, her instincts sharpening now, not just emotionally but strategically. Who are you? She asked, her voice steadying again, though tension still threaded through it. Not who you were. Who are you now? Emily turned toward her fully, and for the first time, there was a subtle change in her posture, not defensive, not aggressive, but revealing. As if this question, finally, was the one that mattered. The room seemed to lean in closer again, drawn not by conflict now, but by anticipation. Jason did not move. He did not speak, because somewhere deep down, he already knew the answer would not be something he could control. Emily held Sophia's gaze for a long moment before responding. Someone who learned the value of being underestimated, she said quietly. It was not a title, not a company name, not yet, but it was enough to shift the energy again, because it carried truth. Jason scoffed under his breath, trying to reclaim some ground. That is not an answer, he said. That is a line. Emily glanced at him briefly, and this time, there was something almost resembling amusement in her expression. You always preferred labels, she said. They made things easier to manage. Jason's jaw tightened again. And you still have not given one, he pressed. Emily let the silence stretch just long enough to remind him that she was choosing this moment, not reacting to it. Then she spoke. Evelyn Carter, she said. The name moved through the room like a spark catching dry air. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was not. Recognition spread in waves. A few guests stiffened instantly. One man near the back lowered his phone slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock. Another whispered something urgently to the person beside him. Sophia's eyes widened slightly, the first real crack in her composure that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with realization. "That is not possible," she said under her breath, though the denial came too late to matter. Jason's face went completely still. No denial, no argument, just stillness. Because he knew that name. Everyone in his world knew that name. Evelyn Carter was not just another executive. She was a force. The woman who had quietly acquired failing companies and turned them into industry leaders. The one who had disrupted markets without warning, who operated with precision and patience, who never appeared until it was already too late to stop her. And now she was standing in front of him. The connection snapped into place all at once, and with it came something far worse than fear. Understanding. Emily watched it happen, watched the exact moment Jason realized that the person he had once dismissed had not just survived. She had risen beyond anything he had imagined. "No," Jason said finally, his voice barely above a whisper now. That cannot be you." Emily's gaze softened slightly, not with kindness, but with clarity. "You always needed things to fit into your expectations," she said. "But the world does not work that way." Sophia took a slow step back, her mind racing now, piecing together everything she had heard about Evelyn Carter, every headline, every whispered conversation, every strategic move that had reshaped entire industries. And now those stories had a face, a past, a connection to the man standing beside her. "You were saying," Sophia began, but the words caught in her throat as the full implication settled. Emily finished it for her, her voice calm, unwavering. "I am saying," she said, "that the woman you both believed was nothing built something you were never meant to control." The silence that followed was not confusion anymore. It was recognition, and in that recognition, the power in the room shifted completely. The name did not fade from the room. It lingered, heavy and undeniable, pressing down on every whispered conversation until even the quietest guest understood that they were no longer witnessing a personal dispute. They were watching something far larger unfold. Jason felt it in the way people looked at him now, not with admiration, but with calculation, as if reassessing everything they thought they knew. Evelyn Carter. The name alone carried weight, influence, consequence, and now it was tied directly to him. "You planned this," Jason said suddenly, his voice low but sharp, grasping for something he could still control. "You waited all this time just to do this here tonight." Emily did not deny it. She did not confirm it either. She simply watched him, her expression steady, almost patient. "I waited," she said, "until the truth mattered." The distinction was subtle, but it cut deeper than any accusation. Sophia's mind was moving quickly now, faster than her emotions could keep up. "If this is true," she said, her voice steadier than before but edged with tension, "then why come back at all?" It was the question no one else had dared to ask yet. Not why she could, but why she would. Emily turned her attention to Sophia again, and this time there was no distance in her gaze. Only directness. "Because unfinished things do not disappear," she said. "They wait." The room seemed to quiet again, drawn into the gravity of her words. Jason shook his head, frustration breaking through. "You're trying to make this into something bigger than it is," he said. "You got hurt. You moved on. That should have been the end of it." Emily's eyes flickered briefly, not with anger, but with recognition. "That is what you told yourself," she replied. "That it was simple, that it ended clean." She took a slow step closer, closing the space just enough to make him uncomfortable again. "But you forgot something," she added. Jason's breath tightened. "What?" Emily held his gaze, unwavering. "You forgot that actions have consequences," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of years. Sophia looked between them, her understanding deepening with each second. "What consequence?" she asked carefully. "What exactly did he do that matters now?" Emily paused, and for the first time, there was a shift in her expression that hinted at something deeper than control. Not weakness, not hesitation, but memory. "He made a choice that night," she said slowly. "A calculated one." Jason's posture stiffened, his instincts recognizing the danger before his mind could fully grasp it. "Emily," he warned, his voice tightening again. "Do not twist this into something it was not." She did not look away. "I'm not twisting anything," she said. "I am clarifying." The distinction landed sharply. And then, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she continued. "You did not just end a relationship," she said. "You secured an advantage." A murmur rippled through the crowd again, sharper this time, more focused. Sophia's eyes narrowed. "Advantage?" she repeated. Emily nodded once. "Yes," she said, "because at the time, I was working on something you wanted." Jason's reaction was immediate, a flicker of panic that he tried and failed to suppress. "That is not true," he said quickly. Too quickly. Emily tilted her head slightly, observing him with the same calm precision she had shown all night. "You remember," she said softly. "You just did not expect me to." The silence that followed was different now. Not confused, not curious, but tense, like something just beneath the surface was about to break through. Sophia's voice dropped, almost cautious now. "What was she working on?" she asked. Jason did not answer. Because he could not. Because whatever he said next would confirm more than it denied. Emily did not rush the moment. She let it build, let the weight of the question settle fully before she spoke again. "An idea," she said. "One you dismissed publicly. One you made sure no one took seriously after that night." Jason's eyes closed for a brief second, as if trying to escape the inevitability of what was coming next. But there was no escape. Emily's voice remained steady, unwavering. "And then," she continued, "you took that idea and built something very familiar with it." The realization moved through the room like a shockwave. Not loud, not explosive, but undeniable. Sophia's grip tightened at her side, her expression shifting from confusion to something far more dangerous. Suspicion. "Jason," she said slowly, her voice controlled but sharp. "What is she talking about?" Jason opened his mouth, but again, no words came. Because this time, silence was not protection. It was confirmation, and Emily knew it. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply stood there, grounded in a truth that had waited years to be spoken aloud. "You did not just try to erase me," she said quietly. "You tried to replace me." And in that moment, the foundation Jason had built his life on began to crack in a way that no amount of control could fix. Jason's silence did not just confirm the accusation. It deepened it. The absence of denial hung heavier than any admission could have. Around them, the room had shifted completely, no longer uncertain, no longer speculative. Now, it was watching with intent, waiting for the full truth to surface. Sophia slowly turned her head toward Jason, her eyes searching his face with a precision that mirrored Emily's earlier calm. "Did you take her idea?" she asked, each word measured, controlled, but sharp enough to cut. Jason exhaled slowly, buying time that he no longer had. "It was not like that," he said finally, though the lack of clarity only made it worse. Emily did not interrupt. She allowed him to speak, knowing that whatever he said now would only tighten the net around him. "We were working in the same space," Jason continued, his voice steadier now as he tried to rebuild control. "There were overlapping concepts. That happens all the time. Is business." Emily's gaze did not waver. "Business," she repeated softly, as if examining the word. "That is what you called it when you took my proposal and presented it as your own 2 months later." A ripple moved through the guests again, sharper this time, more focused. This was no longer vague implication. It was specific. It was measurable. Sophia's breath caught, her composure cracking further. "Jason," she said, her voice low but intense, "tell me that is not true." Jason looked at her, and for a brief moment, something like conflict flickered across his face. Not regret, not quite, but recognition of consequence. "It was not theft," he said. "It was refinement. I made it viable. I turned it into something that could actually succeed." Emily nodded slowly, acknowledging the structure of his argument without accepting its foundation. "You made it profitable," she said, "after making sure I could not." The distinction was precise and devastating. The room seemed to tighten again, Every guest now fully engaged, no longer pretending to look away. Phones remained lifted, capturing every second. Sophia stepped back another inch, her distance from Jason now unmistakable. "You told me you built everything from the ground up," she said, her voice quieter now, but far more dangerous. "You told me there was no one else involved." Jason's jaw tightened again. "There is no one else who could deliver it," he replied, clinging to justification. "Ideas are nothing without execution." Emily's expression shifted slightly, not with anger, but with something closer to clarity. "That is true," she said. "Execution matters." She paused, letting the agreement settle before continuing. "But so does origin." The word origin landed with weight. Not emotional. Foundational. "You erased the origin," she added, "and then you built your reputation on it." Jason's composure fractured again, frustration breaking through. "You had nothing concrete," he snapped. "No funding, no support, no structure. It would have failed." Emily met his intensity without matching it. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe it would have succeeded differently." She took a slow breath, grounding the moment. "But you did not give it that chance." The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was accusatory. Sophia's eyes narrowed further, her mind connecting pieces rapidly now. "And what company was this?" she asked, her voice steady again, but colder. "What exactly are we talking about?" Emily turned slightly, her gaze moving briefly across the room before returning. "A platform designed to restructure small business supply chains," she said, "to give independent owners direct access to distribution networks without relying on predatory intermediaries." Several guests stiffened at the description, recognition spreading instantly among those familiar with the industry. Jason's face went rigid, because they all knew what that was. Sophia's voice dropped into a near whisper. "That is Whitmore Logistics," she said. It was not a question. It was realization. Emily held her gaze. "Yes," she said. "That is what it became." The room seemed to inhale collectively. Whitmore Logistics was not just a company. It was Jason's foundation, his reputation, his power. And now, its origin had been called into question. Jason's voice came out sharper now, edged with something closer to desperation. "That is not how this works," he said. "You cannot just walk in here and rewrite history." Emily's eyes remained steady. "I'm not rewriting anything," she said. "I am restoring what was removed." The distinction was final, unavoidable. Sophia's hand slowly dropped from her side, her entire posture shifting as the weight of what she had just heard settled in. This was no longer about a past relationship. This was about the very foundation of the man she was about to marry. And for the first time that night, it was not Emily who was disrupting the wedding. It was the truth itself. The air in the ballroom no longer felt breathable. It felt heavy, charged with a truth that refused to be ignored. Jason Whitmore stood at the center of it, no longer the man in control, but the man being examined. Every whisper, every glance, every lifted phone now pointed in the same direction. At him. Sophia did not look at the guests. She did not look at Emily. Her eyes remained locked on Jason, searching for something solid, something she could still hold on to. "Tell me this is not real," she said, her voice quiet but firm, the kind of quiet that demanded honesty. Jason exhaled slowly, his mind racing through possibilities, strategies, ways to regain control. But for the first time in years, there was no clean solution. "It is not what she is making it seem," he said, carefully choosing each word. "There are multiple contributors, overlapping ideas, industry trends." That model was inevitable. Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, not emotion, but recognition. She had heard this version before, not from him, but from others like him. "Inevitable," she repeated softly. "That is a convenient word." Jason's voice hardened slightly. "It is accurate," he replied. "You are not the only one thinking in that direction." Emily nodded once. "No," she said. "I was not." The agreement caught him off guard, just enough to create a pause. And in that pause, she stepped forward, not physically, but with clarity. "But I was the one who showed you how it could work," she added. The distinction was precise and devastating. Sophia's breathing slowed, not because she was calm, but because she was processing. "You built your entire company on this?" she asked Jason, her voice lower now, but sharper. Jason met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no easy answer. "I built a company that works," he said. "That is what matters." Emily tilted her head slightly, studying him. "That is what you believe," she said. "That outcome justifies origin." Jason did not respond, because the statement was too close to the truth. Around them, the guests had stopped pretending entirely. Conversations had turned into open discussion. Names were being recognized. Connections were being drawn. And the story was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Emily reached in her clutch again, but this time she did not pull out a document. She pulled out her phone. The simple movement drew immediate attention. Jason's expression tightened instantly. "What are you doing?" he asked. Emily glanced at the screen briefly, then back at him. "Finishing the story," she said. She tapped once, then turned the phone outward, just enough for those closest to see. It was not a video, not a dramatic reveal, just a file. Dated, time-stamped, detailed. "My original proposal," she said calmly. "Submitted 6 months before your first recorded development phase." A collective shift moved through the room again. Not confusion, confirmation. Jason's voice rose slightly, urgency breaking through. "That does not prove anything," he said. "Ideas evolve. That is not ownership." Emily did not argue. She did not need to. "No," she said. "It proves timeline." The distinction was simple. But in business, timeline was everything. Sophia's eyes moved from the phone to Jason, her expression no longer uncertain. It was calculating now, evaluating. "Why did you never mention this?" she asked. Jason opened his mouth, but the answer did not come, because any explanation would only deepen the damage. Emily lowered the phone slowly, her gaze steady. "You built something powerful," she said to Jason. "I will give you that." The acknowledgement surprised him, just for a second. "But you built it on a decision you thought would never be questioned." She paused, letting the weight of that settle. "Tonight," she added, "it is being questioned." The room held still again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be said was already clear. Jason felt it then, not just the loss of control, but the collapse of certainty. The foundation he had relied on was no longer invisible. It was exposed, and exposure, in his world, was irreversible. Sophia took one final step back, creating a space that no longer suggested partnership. It suggested separation. "I need the truth," she said, her voice steady, unwavering now. "Not the version that protects you. The truth." Jason looked at her, and for the first time, there was no strategy left. Only consequence. And Emily, standing just a few feet away, said nothing more. Because she did not need to. The truth had already done what she came here to do. Jason's silence stretched too long, and in that silence, the truth finally took shape in a way that no explanation could undo. He looked at Sophia, then at the crowd, then briefly at Emily, as if searching for some version of control that no longer existed. When he spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the confidence that had once defined him. "It started as a conversation," he said. "She had ideas. I had resources. I saw potential." The room remained still, but the energy shifted again. This was not denial. This was admission, dressed carefully but unmistakable. Sophia's expression hardened, the last thread of uncertainty snapping. "That is not what I asked," she said, her voice firm now, grounded in something far more dangerous than emotion. "Did you take her work and build your company on it?" Jason hesitated. Just a second, but it was enough. "Yes," he said finally. The word landed heavier than anything before it. A wave of sound moved through the room. No longer whispers, but open reactions. Some shocked, some unsurprised, all engaged. Emily did not react outwardly, but something in her posture shifted, not triumph, not relief, but completion. Sophia closed her eyes briefly, absorbing it, steadying herself before opening them again. When she looked at Jason this time, it was not as a partner. It was as someone she no longer recognized. "And you let me stand here," she said slowly, each word deliberate, "in front of all these people, about to marry you, without ever telling me that the foundation of everything you built was taken from someone else." Jason's jaw tightened again, but this time there was no defense strong enough to hold. "It was not that simple," he said, but the words sounded weak even as he said them. Emily's voice cut through, not loud, but precise. "It was exactly that simple," she said. Sophia turned to her, and for the first time, there was no hostility in her expression. Only clarity. "Why now?" she asked. "Why bring this out tonight?" Emily held her gaze, steady, unflinching. "Because tonight was built on a lie," she said, "and I do not believe in letting lies become permanent." The answer settled into the room, undeniable. Sophia nodded slowly, as if something inside her had finally aligned. Then she turned back to Jason, and the shift was complete. "This wedding is over," she said. The words were calm. Final. No hositashchen. No second chance. A collective intake of breath moved through the guests, but no one spoke. No one interrupted, because everyone understood what had just happened. Jason took a step toward her, panic breaking through fully now. "Sophia, wait," he said. "Do not do this here. We could talk about this privately." She shook her head once. "No," she said. "You already chose public when you built your life on something that was never yours to begin with." The distinction was sharp, irreversible. She reached up slowly, removing the ring from her finger. The diamond caught the light for a brief moment before she placed it into his hand. Not thrown, not dramatic, just returned. "You do not get to hide from this," she added quietly. Jason stared at the ring in his palm as if it no longer belonged to him, because in that moment, nothing did. Not the image, not the control, not the future he had constructed so carefully. Around them, the guests had begun to step back, not out of fear, but out of recognition that they were witnessing the collapse of something that could not be rebuilt. Emily watched it all without moving, her expression unchanged, her purpose fulfilled. This was never about humiliation. It was about truth. And truth, once revealed, did not need to raise its voice. Sophia turned away first, walking past Emily without another word, her posture straight, her step steady. She did not look back. She did not hesitate. And as the doors closed behind her, the silence she left behind was louder than anything that had been said that night. Jason stood alone at the center of the room, the weight of every decision he had made pressing down all at once. He looked up slowly, his eyes finding Emily again. But this time, there was no anger, no arrogance, only the realization that the past he thought he had buried had come back, not to haunt him, but to end something he had never truly earned. And Emily, standing there in quiet control, said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say. The doors had barely finished closing behind Sophia when the room seemed to exhale all at once. But the release was not relief. It was the sound of something collapsing quietly in real time. Conversations erupted in low, urgent tones, no longer hidden, no longer polite. Names were being mentioned. Companies. Numbers. Reputations. And at the center of it all stood Jason Whitmore, motionless, the weight of everything finally catching up to him. Emily remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady against the shifting chaos around her. She did not chase the moment. She did not feed it. She simply let it unfold. Jason looked down at the ring still resting in his palm, the diamond now meaningless, just a fragment of something that no longer existed. His fingers curled around it slowly, as if trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. Then he looked up again, his eyes finding Emily with a different kind of intensity now. Not anger, not arrogance, something closer to realization. "You could have done this differently," he said, his voice quieter, stripped of performance. "You could have come to me. You could have handled this without." He gestured vaguely at the room, at the crowd, at the damage that was already spreading beyond control. Emily studied him for a moment, her expression calm, but not detached. There was something deliberate in her gaze, something that acknowledged the weight of his words without accepting their premise. "You mean privately," she said. Jason nodded once, quickly. Yes, he said. This did not have to be a spectacle. Emily's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something sharper, more precise. It was never private when it happened to me, she said. The words were quiet, but they landed with undeniable force. Jason's jaw tightened again, but this time there was no immediate response. Because he remembered, not just the event itself, but the feeling of it, the exposure, the dismissal, the way it had been allowed to happen without consequence. Around them, several guests had already begun to move toward the exits, not out of discomfort, but out of instinct, knowing that whatever remained would not be something they could distance themselves from later. Others stayed, watching, drawn to the final moments of something that had already broken. So, this is revenge, Jason said after a moment, his tone flattening, trying to simplify what he could not control. Emily shook her head slightly. No, she said. Revenge is emotional. This is structural. The distinction hung in the air, difficult to ignore. Jason frowned, confusion cutting through his frustration. What does that even mean? He asked. Emily took a slow breath, grounding the moment before answering. It means I did not come back to hurt you, she said. I came back to correct what was built on something false. Jason stared at her, the words settling in a way that made them harder to dismiss. And now what? He asked. You exposed it. You ended this. What happens next? Emily's gaze did not waver. That depends on you, she said. The answer surprised him. On me, he repeated. She nodded once. Yes, she said, because what comes next is not about what I say. It is about what you choose to admit. Jason's grip tightened around the ring again, his mind racing, calculating outcomes, consequences, damage control. But for the first time, none of his usual strategies felt sufficient. If I admit it, he said slowly, everything I built collapses. Emily did not look away. If you do not, she replied, it collapses anyway. Just slower. The certainty in her voice left no room for argument. Jason looked around the room, then really looked this time at the faces that had once reflected admiration and now reflected something else entirely. Doubt, distance, judgment. The shift was already happening. It had already begun. He let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when denial finally gives way to reality. You planned all of this, he said, not as an accusation, but as an acknowledgement. Emily considered the statement for a moment before answering. I prepared, she said. There's a difference. Jason gave a small, humorless laugh, shaking his head. Of course there is, he said quietly. The irony was not lost on him. For years, he had been the one preparing, controlling, anticipating every move. And now, he was the one being outmaneuvered. The roles had reversed completely. Emily took a step back then, not retreating, but creating space. The moment between them had shifted from confrontation to conclusion. You asked what happens next, she said. This is where you decide whether you want to keep protecting a version of yourself that no longer exists or take responsibility for the one that does. Jason looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time not as someone from his past, but as someone who had surpassed him in ways he had never anticipated. And in that moment, it became clear that the story was no longer about what he had taken. It was about what he would do now that the truth had been returned to him. Emily said nothing more, because the final move was no longer hers to make. Jason did not answer immediately, and that silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. The room, once filled with movement and celebration, now felt suspended in a moment that refused to move forward until he did. Every eye remained fixed on him, not out of curiosity anymore, but expectation. This was no longer about speculation or rumor. This was about decision. Jason inhaled slowly, his chest rising as if the air itself had become heavier. For years, he had mastered the art of control, of shaping narratives before. They could ever take shape on their own. But this time, there was no narrative left to shape. Only truth, waiting to be acknowledged. He looked at Emily again, and this time, there was no resistance in his gaze. Only something quieter. Acceptance, or the beginning of it. You are right, he said finally, his voice steady but stripped of everything it once carried. The words moved through the room like a shift in gravity. Conversation stopped. Phones stilled. Even those who had begun to leave paused where they stood. I took what was not mine, he continued. I justified it. I told myself it was necessary. That I could do more with it than you could at the time. He swallowed, the admission settling into the space between them. But that does not change what it was. Emily did not react outwardly, but something in her posture softened, not in weakness, but in resolution. This was the moment she had prepared for, not the collapse, not the exposure, but the acknowledgement. Jason looked down briefly, then back up, his voice quieter now. I built my company on that decision, he said, and everything that came after was shaped by it. The room remained completely still, absorbing every word. This was not a defense. This was not a negotiation. This was accountability. Sophia, who had stopped near the doors, turned slightly, just enough to hear him clearly. She did not step closer. She did not return. But she listened. Jason exhaled again, slower this time. I thought if I buried it, if I moved forward fast enough, it would not matter, he said. I thought success would erase the way it started. He let out a quiet, almost hollow laugh. It did not. Emily's gaze remained steady, but there was no pressure in it now. No demand. Because the truth was no longer being pulled from him. He was choosing it. Jason straightened slightly, as if the act of speaking honestly required a different kind of posture. What I did was wrong, he said clearly. Not just legally, not just professionally, but personally. The distinction mattered. It was not about consequences anymore. It was about ownership. A ripple moved through the room again, but this time it was different. Not shock, not tension, something closer to recognition. This was the moment everything shifted from exposure to resolution. Jason glanced briefly at the ring still in his hand, then closed his fingers around it, not as if holding on to it, but as if acknowledging what it represented. Then he looked back at Emily. You said this is where I decide what comes next, he said. So here it is. The room leaned in again, drawn to the finality in his tone. Tomorrow morning, he continued, I will release a full statement. Publicly. I will acknowledge the origin of the company. I will correct the record. A sharp intake of breath moved through a few guests. This was not a small gesture. This was everything. Jason did not look away. And I will step down, he added. The words landed heavily, final and irreversible. The foundation of his power, voluntarily relinquished. Sophia closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of it, then turned fully away again. She did not return. She did not need to. Emily watched him, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet stillness in her now that had not been there before. Not tension, not anticipation, completion. Jason gave a small nod, almost to himself. That is what comes next, he said. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, then spoke, her voice calm, measured. Then for the first time, she said, You are building something that is actually yours. The words were not praise, but they were not condemnation either. They were acknowledgement, and that, more than anything else, marked the end of what had begun years ago. The room did not erupt. There was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet understanding that something real had just happened. Something irreversible. Emily took a step back, creating space once more, not because she needed it, but because the moment no longer belonged to her. It had passed, and in its place was something else entirely. Not revenge, not victory, but truth, finally standing on its own. The ballroom did not return to what it had been, because it could not. Something too real had taken place within those walls, something that had stripped away the illusion of perfection and replaced it with something far more lasting. Truth. One by one, guests began to leave, their conversations no longer hushed, their voices carrying fragments of what they had just witnessed out into the wider world. By morning, it would no longer belong to this room. It would belong to everyone. Jason remained where he stood for a long moment after the crowd thinned, the ring still in his hand, but no longer the center of anything. He did not try to stop anyone. He did not try to explain. For the first time in years, he allowed events to move without interference. Emily watched quietly, her presence steady, but no longer anchored to the moment. What she had come to do was finished. The past had been spoken. The truth had been acknowledged. And that was enough. She turned slightly, preparing to leave, but Jason's voice stopped her. Not sharp, not commanding, but quiet. Emily. She paused, then looked back at him. There was no tension in her expression now, only clarity. Jason took a step forward, not to close the distance, but to meet it honestly. I meant what I said, he continued. Tomorrow, everything changes. Emily studied him for a moment, not searching for weakness, but for truth. Then she gave a small nod. It already has, she said. The distinction mattered. What would happen next was not the beginning of change. It was the continuation of something that had already begun. Jason let out a slow breath, as if accepting that fully for the first time. I do not expect forgiveness, he added. Emily's gaze remained steady. That is not something you ask for, she said. It is something you earn. He nodded once, understanding the weight of it. No shortcuts, no control, just consequence. And then, for the first time that night, there was nothing left between them that needed to be resolved. No argument, no unfinished words. Just two people standing on opposite sides of a past that no longer defined them in the same way. Emily turned and walked toward the exit, her steps calm, measured, unhurried. This time, no one laughed. No one whispered. The room did not judge her. It made space for her. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the distant hum of the city, alive and moving forward as it always had. A black car waited at the curb, the driver already stepping forward to open the door, but Emily paused before getting in, her gaze lifting briefly to the skyline. 7 years ago, she had walked away from a room like that with nothing but silence behind her. Tonight, she walked away with something entirely different. Not revenge, not validation, but ownership. Ownership of her story, her work, and the path she had built without permission. She stepped into the car, and as the door closed, the noise of the night softened, replaced by something quieter, something steady. As the car moved forward, the city lights reflecting across the window beside her, Emily allowed herself a single breath, deeper than any she had taken that night. Not because she needed relief, but because she finally could. Back inside the ballroom, Jason stood alone, the weight of what came next settling in fully. Tomorrow would not be easy. The statement, the resignation, the unraveling of everything he had built. But for the first time, it would be honest. And somewhere between loss and accountability, there was something else waiting. Not redemption. Not yet. But the possibility of it. And far from that room, moving through the city that had once overlooked her, Emily Carter did not look back. Because she no longer needed to. The life ahead of her was no longer connected to what had been taken. It was defined by what she had built. And this time, no one could take that from her.